Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's podcast is called Pledges versus Practicality, Are Governments Keeping Their EV Promises, Part 2. And you're here with me, Anna Butna, and Graham Evans, Director at S&P Global Mobility, alongside Shrikant Jayanthan, Senior Research Analyst at S&P Global Mobility.
Hello, Anna. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Anna, for having us here.
This podcast, again, is all about understanding where the EV industry currently stands in key automotive markets globally and how these markets will evolve in the coming years. The regulatory environment, of course, plays a big role here, but how effective have regulations really been so far in advancing electromobility? Last week, we talked about state of the market and regional differences. So I'd like to start out by asking you the following question. It seems giving sizable subsidies to reduce cost of the vehicle is the most favored initiative, so to increase the EV adoption. But is loosening the purse strings, so to say, really enough to carry forward electrification?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anna. I think it's a valid point, and I think the simple answer is that any such initiative, any sort of financial stimulus should be designed to spur the market, and it should be designed to spur the market ideally in a technologically agnostic and democratic way. So okay, we want people to drive EVs, but we shouldn't necessarily pick winners in terms of which particular EV technology. Should we be isolating fuel cell from EV, for example? No, we shouldn't. The aspiration is more zero emissions vehicles on the road. So that's what we're trying to stimulate. But at the same time, in the vast majority of countries, this is not sustainable to continue to artificially prop up the market like this. It's not a bottomless pit of cash for any country, and that includes Norway and their huge sovereign wealth fund. It's not necessarily the case that we would want to continually prop up a market with incentives. So ultimately, I think probably the answer is that we need to find perhaps an additional way for more tailored subsidies to help lower income families, people for whom at the moment the electric vehicle revolution is kind of out of reach financially, or coming to the point made earlier about where the OEMs want to go sell their vehicles. So we want to incentivize OEMs to enter some of these less affluent markets, to bring a greater range of electric vehicles to some of these lower income, less affluent markets in order to provide EVs to consumers that want them. And I mean, indeed, I think it was just yesterday, there was in the news that Maruti Suzuki is making this huge investment in India, obviously underpinned by the parent Suzuki company in Japan. Suzuki is committed to making small, low-cost vehicles that have done a huge job in getting people on the road behind the wheel in India, and their commitment to EV will hopefully enable that for a greater number of people. At the same time, going back to the impact of subsidies and what this can do, we see plenty of examples of when this subsidy is taken away, the market can disappear just as quickly. It can certainly stifle the market. We saw a lucrative incentive in the US state of Georgia, I think back in 2017, that helped spur an adoption of electric vehicles. And the moment it was taken away, things went back to normal. Similar situation in the Netherlands, whereby the legislation that was in place, the financial incentive towards buying a plug-in hybrid, drove a huge adoption of plug-in hybrid vehicles in the Netherlands. And then once that was taken away and the policy was more centered towards battery electric vehicles, the market for plug-in hybrids collapsed pretty much overnight. So everyone bought one in advance of the legislation going away. So there was a big spike in demand, and then demand kind of fell off a cliff for plug-in hybrids in the Netherlands. So some of that transition to battery electric, and again, the Netherlands remains a kind of a good example of a market that's been stimulated and transitions well to battery electric vehicles. But to make the point that subsidies can be effective when they come in, but they can also have a very negative effect when they're taken away. Any more points or context on this one, Shrikant?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I kind of agree with all the points that you made. No doubt, the government support in the form of favorable policies, subsidies, and incentives will continue to play a major role, at least in the short to mid term. But is that enough? Surely not, right? In the long term, at least. Over and above, the governments will have to create an ecosystem that as you said, enables organic and market-driven growth, right? And not just limited, and not just the policies should not be just limited to short-term demand creation through one-time purchase incentives and sorts. Yeah, initially the governments will have to play a bigger role in creating manufacturing ecosystem as well in the country. That will eventually be important in reducing the cost of the vehicles, but this would be a self-sustainable model, right, in the long term, which is what every country would want. This will also necessary will be a kind of a safeguard against any massive price fluctuations, or sort of say the supply constraints that could arise due to external geopolitical factors. We are kind of in the midst of one, right? We're something what we are seeing with the Russia invasion of Ukraine. So basically, the point is there has to be a thought process, right, behind where and what to spend the capital on. For example, setting up infrastructure is important. Sure, it is, right? But so is the location of the stations, of these charging stations. Setting up, setting up on-street charger in a densely populated areas would be a lot more valuable. For the same amount, it would be for the same money, it will be a lot more valuable than in setting chargers in areas with homes with garages, where home chargers can be installed. And we believe home charging will be one of the main forms of charging in the future. And similarly, so should the money be given as subsidies to buyers, which is happening now to spur demand, or should it be used to should the money be used to bolster the supply side, right, by giving incentives to manufacturers of EVs and various key components like batteries, right, which automatically then brings down the cost and one of the key barriers to EV adoption. Right, we've already seen we've already seen countries like say Spain and Thailand, even Thailand, give more preference to actually attracting manufacturers by offering incentives and other regulatory support. So building local manufacturing capacity for vehicles and technologies may actually look like the slower way to transition to electromobility, but it will certainly be more robust and a long-term solution, right? And even talking about technology now, nations will have to be smart, right? In technologies, they cannot be as Graham said, seen as favoring one technology over the other. It's a constantly developing market, constantly developing industry. So they have to be smart as to how they invest their money in technologies. For example, some countries like South Korea and Japan are putting their weight behind hydrogen, right, as a fuel for future mobility. Whereas some countries see newer battery technologies like sodium-ion battery or solid-state batteries as the winners. So it has to be more smart. The countries have to be equally smart in choosing how they want to spend the money. So that's basically the whole point. It has to depend on the kind of natural resources they have, the kind of infrastructure they have, and the ability to scale up, right? All the investment decisions would need to be dependent on these factors.
All right, very good. Manufacturing, you touched on it already. So let's stay on this topic for a bit here. Several countries are now pushing for local manufacturing of EVs through stringent tariff measures. Do you think this could lead to a slowdown in the transition to EVs, or economies being able to fulfill their net zero commitments? Graham, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, Anna. I would say to start off with, I mean, I think obviously the motivation for this, I mean, of course, everyone wants a piece of the action, right? At the moment, this transition to electric vehicles, of course, is going to hit certain countries that are heavily wedded to the internal combustion engine, to its manufacture, to, of course, large amounts of labor at the moment in many countries around the world invested in manufacturing engine components, vehicles containing engines, and this is going to require an adjustment as we transition to EV. So, of course, bringing local manufacturing of electric vehicles and using tariffs to somehow encourage this is naturally a way to to stimulate a local market. I think at the same time, avoiding unnecessary logistics has got to be a good thing. The idea of shipping batteries around the world because they've been made in, China or Korea, and, if they're the only places we can manufacture batteries and we have to ship them all around the globe, of course, we think about the different scope emissions, right? This isn't particularly great for any company's scope 2 emissions, or indeed scope 3 emissions. The fact that this key component of the vehicle is made elsewhere. So I think that bringing local manufacturing to any given country where there's a market demand for electric vehicles is fundamentally a good thing. Yeah, at the same time, the policies around this are quite punitive, quite sometimes quite specific. I mean, I'm based in the UK. We can think of the situation around localized manufacturing that's come about as a result of the UK leaving the European Union. We have this phase-in period of the tariffs, whereby by 2027, for a vehicle to not be subject to tariffs, the vehicle has to have its cells, its battery cells, and its battery pack and its cathode made locally. So if you like, the majority of the value of the battery has to be made locally, or most other battery materials have to be made locally. I know that sounds quite vague, and I guess in the interpretation of the rules at the moment, it is quite vague. But at the same time, this idea that most of the value of the battery has to be made locally for this vehicle not to be subject to a 10% tariff. And this is a 10% tariff when the vehicle is shipped from the UK to the European Union, or vice versa. So ultimately, there's the situation where this is in no one's best interest. Of course, a 10% tariff in the grand scheme of things, sometimes the incentive at the moment towards a battery electric vehicle can be around 10% of the cost. So some might argue, is this a significant enough amount of money to be punitive? Well, of course, if you're a domestic manufacturer like Jaguar Land Rover at the moment, you don't want to be adding 10% onto those vehicles to be exported into the, as a market as important as the European Union. So this is a very important point. And there's other examples as well. The US situation with the USMCA agreement, encouraging local manufacture of EVs and batteries. We see in Germany perhaps a slightly separate situation around, from a union perspective, the union's pushing very hard in Germany, like IG Metall, to ensure that the batteries are manufactured in Germany in order to ensure that, these people who've previously been employed in ICE manufacture can transition to battery manufacture, for example. So I think that, this is going to help is ultimately going to help in achieving net zero commitments, because it stimulates the transition away from ICE, and it prevents unnecessary logistics of the components on the vehicle.
Very interesting. Thanks, Graham. And now briefly to wrap it up, can you give us a sense of how you see the growth of the global EV industry in the mid to long term? Graham, maybe you can start out.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think I'll maybe start with the IHS market forecast. So, as a collective group with our light vehicle, our powertrain colleagues, we regularly get together to discuss, the drivers of the forecast and how we see the long-term picture evolving. And I would say, this has had a fairly significant impact on our forecast. We look at the March 2022 forecast, we see, of light passenger vehicles up to 6 tons gross vehicle weight produced. In 2030, we see that 34% of those will be battery electric vehicle. This time last year, if we looked at that 2030 number, this was around 21%. And of course, on one hand, we might say, okay, well, IHS market was wrong. At the same time, though, the landscape, the industry landscape has changed dramatically for reasons that nobody could have necessarily expected. Obviously, the fallout from COVID-19, the semiconductor crisis, this multitude of stimulus measures, and we've not even really touched upon city bans in this discussion. The huge impact of if in a city or indeed in a given country, you can no longer drive an internal combustion engine vehicle, this is going to massively transition people to battery electric vehicles. UK is a good example of that. The idea that after 2035, there's an exception for plug-in hybrids, or if you like, a grace period for plug-in hybrids. But the idea that after that period of time, it's not going to be possible to buy a new vehicle that's not battery electric vehicle. It's not a battery electric vehicle. Then of course this is stimulating the market massively towards battery electric vehicles and causing a change in our forecast. I think as well the success of the COP conference and shifting attitudes, increased environmental awareness naturally is causing a rise in consumer demand. And I think also, the other key aspect of this is, these battery electric vehicles are becoming increasingly usable. Improvements in battery technology, like Shrikant laid out earlier, and further improvements to come. The charging technology is improving, and we see more abundant, more available charging infrastructure, not without its challenges, of course. But then, this allied to some of the cost reductions that we hope to see as a result of economies of scale, and the fact that battery electric vehicles will filter down to lower segment vehicles can hopefully democratize the uptake as we talked about earlier. I think in terms of the elephant in the room and, some of the fluctuations we've seen in recent weeks in terms of raw material pricing and vehicle availability as a result of constrained supply of certain components. This has the ability to stifle the market, certainly. If we are subject to and dependent upon the availability of raw materials at a given price, there's an awful lot of sway there for the people who are sat on those raw materials. The miners are not going to extract new supplies of nickel, cobalt, etc., out of the ground until the economic conditions are right for them to do so, really. So in this particular case, we need to ensure that if this is our chosen technology of choice, that we have enough raw materials and we can be consistent enough with the pricing of these vehicles to avoid a situation like what's happened with the likes of Rivian and to a lesser degree Tesla in recent weeks, where the price of the models is being changed, it's been passed on to consumers, and naturally consumers have pushed back. I think the other wider issue here around, for some countries, the money is just not there in order to provide electric vehicle stimuli. This is an important point, and everyone should buy into the climate change agenda and the need for it. But at the same time, societally, some other countries have more pressing issues at hand. So I think that has to be put in context in terms of the priority and whether an effective incentives program can be put in place in some of these countries. That said, I think it's fair to say that the direction of travel for the industry is set, certainly out to the end of this decade. It feels like really a month goes by at the moment without some OEM committing to battery electric vehicles by a given date. Some brands saying that, by a certain date, they'll phase out the internal combustion engine. And really, unless the fuel cell electric vehicles or some hydrogen-based fuel or other type of e-fuel can make significant inroads in the market, it seems that battery electric vehicles is the direction of travel. And, like to finish by, from my perspective, just by, back before the pandemic, just before the pandemic, actually, I made a visit to the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit. Back in the 1920s, there was if you like, a technology decision to be made between steam engines, gasoline engines, and electric vehicles. They had EVs then. They even had charging stations of sorts in the cities where you could go recharge your electric vehicles. So sometimes the factors that dictate how different technologies progress and which direction we go. It's not always just, we don't always make the right decisions. And of course, the technology that wins the race can often be for a multitude of reasons other than it was the best for the environment. Usually cost is king. Sometimes it can be political will. So all of these factors come into the equation when we look to how the future might play out, shall we say. Shrikant, a few closing comments?
Sure, Graham. I think you rounded up it pretty well. I mean, most of the you've kind of touched upon most of the challenges that lie in front of us that we need to address if we are to look at or reach the kind of the penetration that would help us have a significant help the transportation industry have a significant impact on reducing its carbon footprint. And exactly as you said, the automotive industry it's well on its way to electrification of transportation, right? Moving away from the ice age, if you will. And we don't see any turning back now, right? The only question that remains now is how quickly the transition will take place. And as we've seen still now, the pace will definitely continue to differ from one region to the other, and from one country to another. Depending on how some of the factors that we've discussed up till now, how they play out. It will, of course, also depend on some of the technologies, as you mentioned, how they advance. The solid state batteries and all technologies like that. Faster advancements could mean quicker deployment of these vehicles with higher range, better safety, lower charging times. These are some of the key barriers that we are facing right now. And faster resolution or better solutions to these problems will certainly quicken the pace. And as you said, on the other hand, better acceptability of technologies like synthetic, climate neutral fuel could actually slightly delay the process of transition, right? And as I said earlier, EVs seem to have turned the corner, and in many of the regions, they are looked upon as mainstream. And to go forward, while the regulatory support will continue to be a necessary aspect for some more time to come, the ideal way forward will certainly be decreasing the role of the government and increasing the role of market dynamics, right? That's how I see the market to go forward, basically.
Great. Thank you both for taking the second set of questions here on this important topic and sharing your thoughts on where governments stand when it comes to keeping their EV promises. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Anna.
And thank you to all you listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our etology@ihsmarket.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Etology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.